So, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We are delighted to welcome you to the Hugh Lane Gallery for our In Conversation with Annalyn Swan, Mark Stevens and Barbara Dawson. This In Conversation is being live streamed via our YouTube channel, as well as being recorded, and we are delighted to welcome our audiences near and far. And I would like to extend my thanks to my colleagues in the Gallery's Education Department, Catherine Neville, Kayla Brzezinski, Cleo Fagan and Jane Fogarty for their assistance in the organisation of this. Annalyn Swan and Mark Stevens, authors of the book Francis Bacon Revelations, published last year, are the award-winning authors of De Kooning, An American Master, which won the Pulitzer Prize in 2005, among many other awards. An art critic for Newsweek, The New Republic and New York Magazine, Mark Stevens has written numerous essays for books, art magazines and catalogues, most recently one for Francis Bacon Late Paintings at the Gagosian Gallery in New York in 2015. He has also written for many general interest publications, including The New Yorker, Vanity Fair and the New York Times, and is author of the novel Summer in the City. Annalyn Swan began her career as a writer at Time magazine. She joined Newsweek as the music critic and subsequently became the senior arts editor at the magazine. She was also editor-in-chief of the women's business publication Savvy magazine and has divided her time between writing and serving as a consulting editor for major media companies. She is a member of the board of the Works and Process series at the Guggenheim Museum and currently teaches in the Biography and Memoir Master's Program at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. Annalyn and Mark are in conversation with Barbara Dawson, director of the Hugh Lane Gallery. In 1998, Barbara secured the donation of Francis Bacon's studio and archive from the artist's heir, John Edwards, and Brian Clark, executor of the artist's estate. As project director, she managed the removal of the studio and contents from London to Dublin and its relocation to the Hugh Lane Gallery. Its opening to the public in 2001 was described by the Washington Post as one of the most stunning events in European circles in years. Francis Bacon Studio remains one of Dublin's great cultural attractions. And tonight, the gallery is remaining open until around 8:45, and we hope you will take the opportunity of revisiting the studio this evening and also enjoying the reception after our conversation. So now I'd like to invite you to extend a very warm welcome to our speakers, Annalyn Swan, Mark Stevens, and Barbara Dawson. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jessica. And just following on that, Mark and Annalyn, again, welcome to the gallery and welcome back. Just before we talk, as Jessica mentioned, you had a wonderful biography of de Kooning, which was a Pulitzer Prize-winning book biography. Was it difficult to decide on Francis Bacon for your next biography, or how did that come out? Was there a competition going on, or was there a tussle with any other artist?
Well, I think we were interested in artists that their lives are interesting as well as their work, and artists that have a kind of cultural importance beyond their work. They're symbolic of some aspect of modern existence. And that's true of de Kooning as an immigrant, and also Francis Bacon as arguably the darkest and also a homosexual artist of the 20th century.
I think that the rule of biographers, though, is you try to find the most interesting, compelling, complicated, often problematic figure you can get. I mean, why set out to write something about a very middle-of-the-road person? You really want the intellectual depth.
Francis Bacon is a stretch for us, and that's good, especially as you get a little bit older. I mean, we're Americans, we're not Irish or English, and we're not homosexual, and we're not nearly as dark as Francis Bacon. So it was all very educational.
Well, you certainly have done a wonderful, wonderful job. And any of you that have read it, I think you'll agree with me. The research is superb. The critical, the incisiveness, the critique of the paintings. So congratulations. And this is the studio, of course, that we see here. And then we're going to, in your book, you unearthed fascinating new material on Francis Bacon, not least during his childhood and early teens in Ireland. His influences, the dynamic of the extended family, chronic asthma, distancing him from the normal pursuits of the countryside at the time, the riding, the hunting, the dogs, and of course his sexuality. And then of course on top of that we have his family living through the First World War, the Easter Rising, the War of Independence, and then the Irish Civil War. That's just before he goes to London. So this is, would you like to chat a bit?
Well, before we start, we just want to thank you first for inviting us and for all of you for coming. And I want to say that in addition to the importance of having the studio here and all its iconographic interest and sort of just remarkable quality of it, I personally love to think of generations of Irish children visiting this studio and looking at it and then coming home, and when their mom says, "Clean up your room," they get to say, "But Francis Bacon, what are you telling me?" I mean, it's such an amazing object, I think, especially for children to see. Kind of reassuring in a way.
Well, it's exactly what you were saying, Alan. I mean, if you're going to have an artist studio as part of the collection, you want one that's glorious. And I mean, it is glorious. It's glorious in its colors. It's glorious in its mess. And the whole idea of the studio was just to actually articulate what it takes to become a great artist. It's not just take the cigarette out of your mouth and paint another one of those funny, blobby, distorted figures. It's a place of contemplation, a private space where you have to face your demons and face yourself to create another great work, I suppose. Yeah.
But one other thing I think we should say at the beginning was for us to have an opportunity to come and sort of make our way, deeper into Irish culture was really, really compelling. It's a particular country and culture in which we've always been very interested. And, the great figures, Eileen Gray, there's so many who we know about, and of course the writers. So the opportunity to come and spend time in, Kildare, County Kildare, and things like that. And also here, this is an absolute motherlode of research that has come over from London. I mean, one has to wonder what were they thinking to let it go, because it is just such a rich mine of information. And so we began the journey here, really, and then sort of went from there in Francis's life.
Well, it's interesting to contrast this picture with the room you just saw, the studio. The man traveled some distance. The studio is a great room, and Bacon was always involved with rooms, and rooms can be a kind of performance. And his early rooms, when he was a designer, very clear, almost utopian. His later room, the one you know here, another picture of the 20th century. So he's creating beautiful rooms. This amazing photograph of Francis and his mother is a kind of social performance, and Bacon was always very, very interested in performance. And you can see that this is a performance of the big houses of Anglo-Irish culture, in a way. It's an ideal photograph. It's presenting a picture of perfection. Best we know, his mother never really read a book.
And ride a horse.
Right, and she's not a bad person at all, but she was mainly interested in fox hunting and horses and parties. And poor Francis was he was a shy boy. He was effeminate, so he wasn't really meant for that horsey culture, those horsey parties. He had desperate asthma, so he was ill. He was allergic to horses. The dusty saddle in the hall was a nightmare for him. So Bacon, if you think of him, he's lots of social performance, but then the eruption from underneath. And here you see the social performance.
And this, of course, I mentioned extended family, and of course his grandmother on the Firth side. The Firths were the fun, weren't they? The Bacons were the more serious.
Yes.
And this is his grandmother
Well, the Frists had the money, and the other side had the name.
Yeah, yeah.
An old story.
Yeah.
But this is Granny Supple. You're going to see two pictures of women. Not these two, but the nanny is next. But two women who saved Bacon's life, really, we think. Bacon looked to this woman on the left, Granny Supple. She was so wealthy that she lived exactly as she liked. She did exactly as she liked. She loved performance. She loved society. She took the shy, introverted child when he was very young, 12, 13, would take him to parties, and I think introduced him to the pleasure that fun-loving parties can provide certain kinds of people. I think we can go to
She's
the next.
with her two husbands.
Yes, and she had three husbands. This one on the right was a dreadful man.
Walter Bell, yeah.
Walter,
let me fill this in a little bit. So Granny Supple ditched the husband on the right, Walter Lorraine Bell, during World War I, conveniently. But he was the one who first brought the family, who are obviously Anglo-Irish, to Ireland. He was a great hunter and loved to be, riding to hounds. He was also really a mean bastard, and he would hang up cats, take their claws off and hang them up to get the blood up in the hounds before hunting. The whole family was terrified of him. So conveniently, as it's sort of right in the book, during the war he went back to England to serve, and Granny Supple kind of floated away to Carrie Supple, who was at Strafford, was head of the Royal Irish Constabulary. So a very different character indeed, and somebody who Francis Bacon really, really liked.
And then the other famous woman in his life, of course, was Jessie Lightfoot.
Yeah, Jessie Nanny or Jessie Lightfoot.
Yeah.
She was with Bacon from his very earliest, really infancy to when she died in 1952. She died still living with him. She looks in this picture very starchy, like a classical nanny. But in fact, she was more salt than starch, I think. She was very down-to-earth, practical, one of these wonderful women who is sort of brass taxi and, just none of the nonsense.
Yeah.
And I think that was she provided a kind of reserved love for Bacon, too, which he obviously needed. She would later in life, she would hang out with Bacon and look at the adverts in the Times to figure out which gentleman might need a companion.
And she also stood at the door to the loo when Francis Bacon would give illegal gambling parties on Cromwell Place, and she would charge a quid or so back in the day. That was a lot of money. Oh, yeah. But if you didn't pay up, there was no loo.
There was no loo. And the rumor is that she slept on the kitchen table in Cromwell Place, so during the time of the illegal gambling and all of that.
I think that's not a rumor,
I think it's true.
Well, there's no room. I mean, if you know the layout of Cromwell Place, I mean, where would Nanny go? And so it was
exactly.
the kitchen. Yeah.
So we'll move on to the paintings now, and very early one, 1933 Crucifixion.
1933.
And then we have here a page from a Baron von Schreck van Notzing. It's called the Phenomena of Materialization, which was published in 1923. Basically, he was very interested in the paranormal, and then it became sort of into the fraud and the ectoplasms. And
right.
But you have a lovely, the take on this crucifix.
So this is his 1933 Crucifixion. This is the first painting that Francis Bacon did that got any attention at all, and it got a lot of attention. What happened is, as Barbara's saying, he at the time was very, influenced by spiritualism, which I'm sure you know is sort of Victorian interest in ectoplasmic spirits that would supposedly emanate from the dead, and seances and all those things. And so this early crucifixion obviously shows a big debt to Pablo Picasso, and indeed Bacon himself always said that was true. But it's also, as we say in the book, it has a very sort of ephemeral, spiritual, abstract feeling. You can almost sense a kind of ghostly eminences coming from this painting. This actually appeared in a very influential book of the time by Herbert Reed, who was one of the leading critics of the time, and it appeared opposite Pablo Picasso, Crucifixion. Now, if you can imagine, this was done when Francis Bacon was 23 years old. He was born in 1909, so this was a very, very early for him. It was a show that was organized at a brand new, a very fancy Mayfair gallery, Freddie Mayer Gallery. So there was this excitement about the gallery. There was an excitement about this Herbert Reed book. And then Sir Michael Sadler bought this painting. So this really was what you would think would be the beginning of a great career for this very young artist. And of course, it didn't work out that way. Yeah. He had decades of
he hit
struggle.
rock bottom almost, didn't he, after that?
Yes, shortly after this painting, Bacon liked to pretend that he painted this, and then he did nothing. And with a kind of aristocratic ease, he suddenly happened upon the next painting, the Three Studies, the famous painting. In fact, between 33 and before that and 45, he worked very, very hard every day, mostly. He didn't have much money. He was an artist in a garret, literally. He suffered repeated failures, rejections by galleries and tastemakers of the time. I mean, he had support too. He was never too far from money. People would help him. But he really suffered as a young artist, and he never wanted anyone to know that, of course. He wanted to just be born fully prepared.
He disappeared, didn't he?
Well, in Steep, you want to talk about that?
Well, before we get there, though, yes, during the war, he went for 2 years into a house in the country in Petersfield, a tiny little place called Steep, where he read voraciously sort of Nietzsche and looked at Picture Post magazines. And that was, of course, filled with, Goering and all these, brutal shots of the Nazis. So that was a sort of formative influence indeed on Francis Bacon.
This is an interesting pairing that Barbara has done here with Nietzsche on the left and the famous Triptych on the right, because in Steep, in this period when he did work. He was an ambulance driver in London during the very early part of the Blitz, but his lungs and his asthma made that impossible. He retired to a cottage in the country where he read extensively. Didn't want anyone to know about this either. This is one of the things that we really, I think, have figured out, that he self-educated himself, as Annalyn said, by looking at popular press, but also reading people like Nietzsche and the Greek classical dramatists in particular. And Nietzsche was very important to him for a number of reasons. One of them was personal, which is that Nietzsche also was a sickly person who really struggled during his life and who had an obsession with weakness and power. And Bacon is the artist of our century, which is all about terrible power and terrible weakness, who best expresses those things, I think. And the particular phrase, beyond good and evil, is a good way to describe, I think, this famous triptych, which of course has been written about endlessly. But one thing that I like to mention about it is that the center, it's three very good monsters, of course, but the middle monster is all of them eyeless, as if human beings really don't see, and as if it's all about the nerves and the body. But the middle monster is rather a friendly fellow, isn't he? I mean, he looks like he's a drunk who might sidle down the bar and put his arms around you, or a disagreeable uncle at a family party, who you really, but he's related to you. So it's not good and evil. You can't say it's the Germans who did this. You can't say it's just fascists. It's you. He's a relative.
Which was shocking. This was shown in 1945 in the Hanover Gallery called Study for Three Figures at the Base of Crucifixion. And Richard Hamilton, whom we showed here some years ago before he died, he recalls going in to see that exhibition and saying, "What the hell is this?" So now we're kind of inured to it and a little bit more immune, but at the time it really did shock.
Well, also the major guns at that opening were Graham Sutherland and Henry Moore, you know, and so people were coming into the gallery wanting to feel the war's over, we can now all move on, and then as we, you know, write in the book, only to come up against this, which was, you know, you can't even see how orange, eerie, scary orange that color is. It's sort of incredible bacon orange. You know.
The war was still on when this painting was first exhibited, or this triptych. It was the end of the war, but it was the spring of '45, right when Londoners wanted to be cozy and comfortable and rediscover the drawing room and then walk in the park, and then they were confronted with this.
He had particular influences. It wasn't, as you say, the Greeks. It wasn't all of the Greeks. It wasn't Euripides. It wasn't Socrates. It was Aeschylus and something. And the same with old masters, such as Velázquez. There were particular artists or masters that he really did like, and one of them would be Velázquez.
Well, Velázquez basically, Goya were very, you know, obviously extremely early and important influences, and a little bit later on, there was a moment when he loved Van Gogh, which then he completely said, no, this is not me, these paintings are, I disavow them.
Van Gogh paintings, but he always loved Van Gogh.
He did love Van Gogh. But Velázquez was, from the very beginning of his life, I don't know when the Jonathan Brown book was published.
I should have that, I don't know.
Yeah, much after. Yeah. But you know, when Sam Hunter was one of the very first critics to discover Bacon, and it was 1949. He was American, very much before his time, or before America really got interested in Francis Bacon. He came to Bacon's studio and persuaded Bacon to let him put a montage of images on the floor. And one of the images in that montage, he took a couple photographs. Some of them were the German generals, as you know, the Goebbels and you know, all the ones we were talking about. But then there was this. So this was a constant in Francis Bacon's life, Velázquez. And he did a series of paintings after Velázquez's, they were called studies after Velázquez's portrait of Pope Innocent X, a painting in Rome.
In Dorio Pamphili, so he did a complete series, including this one.
And this one, actually, this is very interesting. The one that's the most famous is a 1953 one that you could see at the Royal Academy now. It's on view in London. And that was sort of the culmination of the series, and the one the critic David Sylvester always said was probably the great masterpiece of Bacon's career. But this one is another one that David Sylvester really, really liked. This had been part of a series that he was making for his gallery, and at the Hanover Gallery, Erica Brawson. And he would always work at the very last minute to get a show on the road. I mean, he just could not get inspired until it was almost too late. So he had painted a trio of these Velázquez portraits. He wanted them to go, would have been one of his first, you know, triptychs, but he, at the very end, thought that the one on the left and right didn't agree with each other, and so he pulled the whole thing. They were lost for decades, and were finally found rolled up.
And first shown, in
a Framer studio, and so there you have it. But David Sylvester, towards the end of his life, wrote a final book on looking back at Francis Bacon, and he said that this was one of the great paintings of Bacon's career, along with the 53 Velázquez painting, and you can see why. I mean, in both paintings, you have the Pope with the all of the panoply of you know, guilt and authority figure, but yet you also see him screaming, as we write in the book, as if he's seen not the Holy Father, but the devil himself. Yeah. And then you have this dark striated lines behind, that sort of imprison, that just serve to imprison this figure who is screaming in terror out at you as a viewer. And Sylvester loved those lines that come out, sort of, that bring you, kind of bring the painting out.
You can't really see them in this photograph, or any photograph. You have to see the picture in person to see how the flesh and the lines are interwoven. But you know, Velázquez is also so important to Bacon, because there's never been anyone better at painting flesh. And he was also not about line, Velázquez. Bacon really couldn't draw very well, but he loved to use paint to suggest and evoke flesh, and that's what Velázquez did. And then what he does in these paintings is the flesh begins to you know,
it goes into
ripple
whorls
and flash, and again, you
sometimes,
can't, in reproduction you can't tell, but in person the flesh begins to, you know, shimmer like this.
This was also in our Francis Bacon in Dublin exhibition. It's made, as you say, it's more diabolical than heavenly, more sort of furnace and flesh burning than incense and, you know, reverie. So it's a very strong painting. One of his great friends, of course, was Lucian Freud, friend for about 25 years, and who knew him better than anybody for one stage. And we have here a photograph on the left by John Deacon, of course, a lot of photographs, and then on the right we have a reproduction found in the studio of the central panel of 3 studies of Lucian Freud. The painting, the triptych here, terrific triptych. It's sort of, to me, this triptych is very, very interesting in how the space within the space within the space, nailing the figure into the painting, which Bacon sometimes had problems with, didn't he?
Well, what great artists often do is they make their problems into virtues. You know, they know how to do that.
Yeah.
And so Bacon, that's sort of like, could be in a Spanish bullfight. He likes Spanish bullfights a lot, that ringtone. Bacon often used these space frames and to help control visually the space. But the space frames are also have an existential import. They suggest that we're trapped, even if we don't think we are, that we're in these transparent boxes. And Freud, this is such a fascinating triptych because it's as if 2 sides of Freud are looking at a single Freud. It's as if 2 sides of yourself are studying yourself. And it suggests this mind within a mind and the wheels within the wheels and a kind of, you know, just you're never going to quite escape. And visually, one fabulous thing about this, I think, is if you can't see it that well, but those of you who are art savvy will know that one thing that pompous professors always talk about is the flatness of the picture plane. Well, you'll see that Freud's shoe is like this, and a couple of those, and it defines the flatness of one side of the space frame. You see, the other shoe is getting out, and the implication is that we can kind of wrestle around the edges of the boxes that we place around ourselves. But we're not always going to get our whole body out. So it's
terrific.
It's sort of, there's a kind of an internal narrative in this picture that's fascinating.
But that existential notion being always the room and the space frame.
And the picture you showed before of Lucian Freud on the bed, you see the 2 horizontal lines on the headboard there?
Yeah,
and you go to the next one, go back to the...
there you
there
go.
it is.
There
in
it
the center
is.
panel.
And it looks as the sort of a contemplation, and the middle one is the central panel is more defiant one, but barely gets the foot outside there, but still is contained within that spatial frame.
One thing we should just note is the great friendship between Freud and Bacon, because in the late 40s, when they started to become friendly, they became such a pair that other people would comment to us that they hated when they were together because they were so intense. That the 2 of them would see each other in a room and then immediately disappear into a corner and just be intense with each other. And it was a friendship that was artistically interesting for both people. You know, it went both ways. Freud helped Bacon and Bacon helped Freud. And sort of one of the unfortunate things in the lives of these 2 painters was that when finally Lucian Freud started to become famous, we write in the book there was like 2 stallions in the same stall, whinnying at each other. So gradually the friendship kind of fractured. But he was a huge inspiration to Bacon, and I can't even remember how many paintings that Bacon, maybe 20, 25 paintings.
I meant to look that up, and I actually was talking to David Dawson last week, and who is the studio manager and is Lucien, Freud's studio manager, and he said that Lucien always talked about Francis, always continued to talk about
even
it.
after the falling
out.
out.
And the fight, and it all confirms exactly what you're saying, that
Lucien Freud kept one of the greatest Bacon paintings above his bed.
Yeah.
And would never show it.
And never allowed
it was so
to
important to him. Yeah.
And the story about him being very upset, seeing Bacon's eye hanging out after a fight with his lover, Peter Lacey. He told David Dawson that, because you want to know, is this a myth? Because things recede into history and become myths, but it is true. However, you in your book, really have researched the one, Peter Lacey, who now becomes a whole figure, a personality, not just a sort of a somewhat sadistic,
one of the great pleasures of writing a biography is to try to do what E.M. Forster described as moving from a flat character to a round character. And we have with Peter Lacey, he's typically been presented as by the way, his family originally from Ireland.
The de Lacys.
Yeah. He's been presented as this sadistic fighter pilot who was a Spitfire hero, and none of it was true. He was sadistic and violent when he drank, but Francis Bacon was also masochistic and could provoke intentionally those kinds of rages. And in addition to that, Lacey was a sensitive character who was deeply thwarted. He's Catholic. He was suppressed. His favorite musician, he wanted to be a jazz pianist. His favorite musician was Fats Waller, the American. And there's almost nothing more different than you could imagine, right, than Fats Waller and the kind of upper crusty Catholic background that he had in the Midlands from a wealthy family. Yeah. So he was a person who dreamed of the stage, but he was thwarted. And so their relationship was very, very difficult, but it was also loving, and neither man ever got over the other. They
never got, that's what was very interesting. Here we see them holidaying together on the Riviera.
Yeah, I mean, Bacon said even his calves were beautiful. Yeah. And you can see from the photograph that he really did think he was
This was actually about 1951. They were in sort of on a Roman holiday late in the season in Ostia, in the port of Rome. So there's a whole series of snaps here at the Hugh Lane about this holiday, which really, you have quite the collection of photographs that were, and imagine what that says about Bacon had kept those photographs all those years after Peter Lacey's death, which happened in 1961.
Yeah, after the Tate just as the Tate retrospective.
So there had been his first big retrospective, at the Tate in 1961, and the day of the opening of that, which really put Francis Bacon on the map for the first time, he sent a telegram to Peter Lacey to tell him about the great success of the show, and a telegram came back that said Peter Lacey had just died.
Yes, and so...
Yeah, so this is a triptych that he painted after the death, and it's very un-Bacony in some ways, very Bacony, but very un-Bacony. On either side, you see Peter Lacey, and they're different, very different portraits, aren't they? On the left, he could almost be a magnificent sea captain looking on the bridge, staring out over the water, in control, very firmly painted. On the right, there's you can't see it very well there, but there's a great acreage of nose and a very strong character. And in the middle, you see Francis depicting himself in a self-portrait, and look what that looks like.
He looks so tragic.
It's a face that is just dissolving in front of your eyes. The lines can't hold. There's no strength. The eyes are as sad as any eyes you could imagine.
Devastating.
So this is, you think of Bacon as maybe an angry, shouting, screaming, but he could also be very soft and subtle. And here you see him revealing himself.
Yeah, and this was done after he died in 1962. He also did this great triptych in 1962, Study for a Crucifixion, 1962, which he said he did during a hard bout of drinking. One of the few, I think, triptychs. Now, whether he's right, but he did say he usually couldn't paint while he was drinking, but the hangovers drove him on.
Well, he was a very theatrical man. He was interested in social performance. He felt his art had not been going so well. and he needed a capstone for this exhibit, a good final act. And this was the picture. It's a picture that Annalyn says she can't even look at because it's so disturbing. And indeed, it is. It's a picture of human sacrifice, really. On the right, you see a crucifixion based on Cimabue and some other things. And in the middle, you see a modern human sacrifice. And what's so disturbing about it is not that it's a sad or difficult subject. We know all about that. It's that it's so beautifully painted. Again, you can't tell without seeing it, but the paroxysm in the paint is magnificently painted, and it creates a very tense feeling in the eye and the soul because you are right up there with pleasure, pain, bloodlust, glorious painting, and it's all kind of combined. And then on the left, you see these two rather goofy characters. I think of them. No one knows this, but I think of them as critics. People like me, writers, and they're looking at human sacrifice, and they're trying to come to terms with it, and they're kind of opining about it and saying this and that and the other. But they can't begin to describe what's happened in the 20th century, and they have their legs of lamb flaring out from their legs.
Exactly.
Like they're part of a sacrifice.
And Barbara, you should talk about what you found about the inspiration.
And just when you're talking about it, I think when he gets it, there's nobody like Francis to knock you out viscerally.
Yeah, that's right.
When he gets the paint, the actual manipulation of the paint.
I mean, it's like a sacrificial stone.
But it's the depth of paint and the manipulation of the paint. So this on the left is marked as two art critics. And when I was researching a paper for Francis Bacon and Foo, he had Mrs. Beaton, he had Elizabeth David, he had all of these books. So there's something, and we discovered this in Mrs. Beaton's book. You see the joints of mutton there, which he just lifted and created here as two sort of monsters coming, sort of, I don't know, as you say, hip joints like flowing.
What's so wonderful about it in a way is that Bacon had a very cozy side.
Yeah.
He loved his kitchen. He loved to be fussy about tea. He had a kind of warm, enveloping side, which this cookbook is like. And also silly. And if you go back for a second, there's comedy in this, right? One of the best things in really good literary books is if there can be a tragic book with some comedy in it. Then you feel like you've covered the waterfront. I think this is sort of satirical comedy. On the left, there'd be people who would disagree. But then that goofy little dolphin, like a Disney character. What? Is it a dog or a dog? Is it a dog? Well, I don't know what it is, but
You're talking about the cats and the awful step-grandfather or one of the wives of the grandfather.
Oh, right, cats, cutting off the cat claws.
Well, we do,
Love the dogs.
Well, I mean, there's juxtaposition of this grisly crucifixion image, and then this bizarre shadow. I mean, where did that come from?
Exactly, There's always something like that,
Yeah.
Well, one really other important thing about this was the first time Francis Bacon painted one of these great big triptychs for which he is now celebrated. And he did this to cap, of course, his that 62 retrospective. But before that, there'd just been the little tiny triptych, the three figures of 1945. It's quite small, three studies.
It's very small when you look at it.
It's very small.
Yeah.
And then suddenly he discovers with this painting his ability to hold that kind of drama across.
He really holds it in this, and the stage setting, the rooms, the hermetically sealed rooms here, and the reference to Cimabue, which he said like the figure of Christ was like a worm sliding down the cross. And then we have him literally stealing images from cookbooks.
But that's the detritus in the studio is so important because you can see the cause and effect.
Exactly. Sometimes
he borrowed anything.
And sometimes it's literal and it's really amusing, and other times you see it referentially.
When Bacon would look at that image of the mutton, this was, Bacon would say to people, he'd say, you think this is ordinary. Right? This is just what your nice little cozy grandma book of cooking. But in fact, what we're talking about here is an animal cut into pieces and presented in this cozy, nice way. Who are you people? What are you doing cutting up an animal and doing
And remember him in Vogue magazine, he was photographed bare-chested with two sides of beef, which I find really Whoa, it's quite it packs a punch, because you look back then at the Cimabue, which also has the ribs.
Right.
So you're absolutely animal, man,
Right.
man,
Right.
animal. But the 60s was a very good period for Bacon. It was a rich period of creativity.
It was, and you know, as we write, it was his portrait decade, and so he'd come through all of this sort of drama, and then he really went to his closest friends. You already saw the Lucian Freud, but for inspiration. This is the marvelous character Muriel Belcher, and she was the owner and the person who presided over the famous Colony Rube Club, the Colony. She was a very caustic, like dirty-mouthed.
Yes, she was, very loud.
Lesbian who had a sort of staccato delivery, and she'd sit by the door and love to throw out people who weren't members or who she didn't like, and she'd say, "On your way, dearie, and get a facelift while you're at it," and other lines. As we say in the book, several times Francis Bacon's friends would note that even Francis, with his rhinoceros side, would sometimes blanch when Muriel would come on to him. But they were wonderful friends from the get-go, and she invited him to be a member and not pay any dues, and she said, "I'll pay you £10 a week, you bring in your friends, you can have limitless champagne," and of course she was betting that he was going to become a great artist, and she bet correctly.
She bet right, and just to put it in context, this was set up at a time when there were two things: homosexuality was outlawed, and also the drinking laws. Remember, we had the Holy Hour. Well, theirs was 5:30 to 6:30, I think. But if you had a private club, you could drink all afternoon. Now, it wasn't exclusively for gay people at all, but certainly, she used to always call Frances she, his daughter today.
That's right.
And she'd always say, "Oh, shut up, cunty, and go and buy another bottle of champagne," wasn't it?
Yeah,
She was fantastic.
Should I tell that story about in the hospice? I like that story.
Oh yes, yes, that's a good story.
So when she's in hospice, she's dying, and Francis regularly visits her, despite the fact that he really was made uncomfortable by hospitals. But he was very kindly and devoted to his friends. So he would visit her, and she was in a hospice room with another aging lady who was very ill and was very starchy. And as you said, she always called Francis by a female name, and one of the nicer ones was Mary. So she would go, "Hello, Mary," when he would come into the club. And so in hospice, whenever he would visit, she would sing out, "Hello, Mary." And this happened several times until finally the starchy, rather aristocratic lady in the neighboring bed looked at Francis and said, "Are you a woman?" And Francis thought about it for a while and said, "Sometimes."
It was really good. And then, of course, after George Dyer came on the scene,
yes, exactly.
Handsome George.
So imagine in your mind's eye, Francis has gone from Peter Lacey, who's his own age and very upper class, and well educated, to George Dyer, who was an uneducated Cockney East Ender, who was a failure as a gangster. Lucian Freud always used to say, poor George, he couldn't even be a bad thief. But George, the great story about George Dyer, who was in Francis's life from 63 to 71, was that one night Francis was in his studio and he heard his scrabbling, and suddenly somebody fell through the skylight, and so the story went that Francis said that he said to the burglar, allegedly George, "Well, you have a choice. Either I will call the police or we can make love on the spot." So this was this wonderful story that circulated for years. Alas, it wasn't true. They met at a posh homosexual bar near Harrods. But George, who was bumbling and hapless in every possible way, had the great talent of being able to sit, as he is here, for hours without moving a muscle. And he also had the most wonderful prow. Look at that nose on the right. Yeah. And so Francis Bacon loved to paint him. He painted him again and again and again. And this is one of the great George paintings of George on a bicycle. We love to show this particular painting because it's so unlike the rest of the Bacon canon. You know, where's all the ferocity? You know, it shows that Bacon could be extraordinarily versatile and loving. So here's old George with his wonderful prow of a nose on a bicycle. And we also like to say that when John Russell wrote about Bacon's paintings of George, which John Russell really admired, he said that one other great and wonderful thing about George Dyer was he had the face of an English everyman. So there you go, the prow, the sort of smile. It's really a delightful painting and such a different one.
It certainly conjures up energy and speed, you know.
Right, and lightheartedness. So
here we have another great friend.
Here we have another. Everybody knows of Francis Bacon as a painter of men. Well, one of the interesting things is if you spend long enough time with Francis Bacon, you really do see how he was also a painter of women, right, Barbara?
Oh, yes.
And this is a very underemphasized theme about him. But this is his wonderful friend, Isabel Rawsthorne, also a painter. They became friends around 1949. She had been Giacometti's mistress, which indeed impressed Francis Bacon. He was very impressed with Giacometti. She also had a sort of magnificent aristocratic carriage. And so here on the left is a John Deacon photograph, which then transmogrified by Francis Bacon directly into the painting on the right, the same kind of stature of Isabel Rawsthorne. And as we say, she seems to be a Bohemian duchess surveying her kingdom. He has one of his space frames, which he loved to use to, as Mark said earlier, to kind of designate or focus a painting, the central part of his painting. And then behind her, you have automobiles becoming bulls. Francis Bacon was also very interested in bulls and in paintings of bulls. And so here you have Isabel sort of as a sort of power figure focused right in your face, framed and with this sort of circle around her to indicate that she is indeed a Bohemian duchess.
She is indeed. It is a terrific painting. And then Henrietta Mores, another great friend. Another
great friend and also a great Bohemian character. She sort of swanned into Soho and then very early on, maybe 18 or 19, she began drinking with the boys and became a friend of both Lucian and Francis. And at one point, Bacon asked his friend John Deacon to take photographs of Henrietta because he wanted to start painting women's bodies. So on the left, you have a photograph of Henrietta. John Deacon came and initially photographed her in a sort of pornographic way, the other way round, if you know what I mean. And then Francis said, no, that's silly fool, that's not what I want. So he got the sort of classic women on a bed photographs.
I just say though, but look what a beautiful photograph that is that way. I mean, in the studio, it's somehow been manipulated with paint and almost like he went like this and created a Bacon. I mean, it rumples just like a Bacon, doesn't it?
And these are all deliberate. They're not just...
I mean, it's just, he's done something to that photograph. And as Annalyn said, he was not at all interested in pornographic sorts of photographs. He wanted the body in an interesting,
sort of plastic way.
Interesting way.
To get the plasticity.
In fact,
of the body.
and Henrietta was so kind of dear, really, to agree to be photographed in the nude anyway. She didn't want to, but she thought if a great artist asks you, you have to. And then John Deacon began selling the pictures in pubs.
John Deacon, John Deacon was a famous Vogue photographer, and I believe now, I may be corrected on this, but I believe he's the only person to be fired twice from Vogue.
I think that's correct. Could you go back for just 1 second? I just wanted to point out that just like Isabel Rawsthorne, Henrietta was a force, you know, and she told her daughter that that Frances Bacon, she said, loved her statuesque body, the solidity that she had. So, quite a powerful presence. And then, as Barbara was, those were the famous series. I mean, he painted a lot of these of Henrietta sort of lying this way on a sort of chaise. And Barbara, you were talking earlier about the hypodermic syringe in this painting.
Yeah, and then that also brings us in, just as an aside, I think in your book, the notion of Bacon's, his health, his shyness, his asthma. So I think you mentioned sometime he was held together with pins almost, like prescription drugs, alcohol, and the hypothermic, I know he didn't do drugs as Henrietta did and was upset by it, but I remember him going, well, I don't know what I was doing here. He knew what he was doing here. This is a hypodermic syringe, and he is nailing, again, the figure right down, isn't he, onto the mattress, and I love this very, if you like, classic, division of the planes of color in that. It's very beautiful.
And very quiet next to the busyness.
But just one follow-up to what you said, Barbara. One of the things we did probe that had not been probed before about Francis Bacon is that he was sort of held together by tape and safety pins from a very early age. We had mentioned that he was asthmatic to the point of almost dying when he was young, but there was never a moment in his life from his early 20s on when he was not seeing a doctor, and very early in his life found Dr. Paul Brass and his father. And an interesting and little known fact that Francis Bacon, for virtually his whole life when he was in London, would go and see his doctor once a week. This was a man who had a sort of calibrated cocktail of drugs that he would take in addition to alcohol, because he had so many terrors, so many things that were roiling his mind. It was very difficult for him to relax.
Yeah, he was also very interestingly shy, very shy when he was young. And in his interviews with David Silvestri, he said, I was very shy till I was 25, and he thought how stupid it would be to be shy man when you're older, and I've lost all those years. So there's a very fragile side to this bombastic, theatrical public persona.
Well, as you know, actors are often very shy.
Exactly.
I mean, they're actors because of that.
Philosopher, of course, here we have Michel Leiris, the famous French philosopher.
This is another absolutely marvelous photograph here in the Hugh Lane. And for me, Bacon idolized French culture, in part because he felt rejected by English culture, not just because of the Anglo-Irish side, but because he'd really never gone to school. He spent 6 months in school total, right about? I mean,
oh no, a year and a half.
A year and a half in school. So he really was unschooled. He was an autodidact. So he felt intimidated by the Oxbridge world. And when the French took him up, he adopted French culture in a way because they idolized him and he idolized them. And in this photograph, you see Michel Leiris on one side, and he was one of the great mandarins of the time and a person who was devoted to Bacon. And what I love about the photograph is you see that his hand there, to me, absolutely epitomizes a certain kind of French aphoristic clarity. I mean, it's practically a witty hand. But then you see the chaos of blue. It's actually usually blue right there beside the aphoristic hand, and the smear in the face. And then on the other side of the door jamb, you see an entirely different apprehension of the world, right? It's not the Leiris French. It's a bit deer in the headlights, no? I mean, it's a kind of an astonished.
A bird of prey. I mean,
well, a bit, yes. A bird. I mean,
it's terrifying.
Well, in a lot of ways, it's just a lot of things, but it's not the Leiris thing. And it's very nice that they're divided in a doorway here. They were devoted to each other.
They were.
It's a beautiful photograph.
It's a beautiful photograph. And of course, then he was honored as a living English artist, or Anglo-Irish, living English artist, to show at the Grand Palais in Paris.
Yes, he was the first.
71.
Yes, he was the first English artist to be have a great exhibition at the Grand Palais. I'm sure you've seen the Grand Palais, which is sitting up by the Seine, and it's just a magnificent building. You know, Beaux-Arts, all sorts of things, chariots coming out of the.
So he loved all of it.
And he absolutely loved it. And as Mark was saying, so Larry was such a good friend, and the Mandarins. But this is the person on the left here is Valerie Besten. Valerie Besten was Francis Bacon's minder at the Marlborough Gallery for decades. And the owners of the Marlborough Gallery realized that they needed somebody in place to take care of Francis because he was going to go off the grid. He'd wind up in the East End getting beaten up by thugs. So they installed Valerie Besten, and Valerie Besten was a wonderful minder. And here she is. If you can see this, what we're missing here is a sort of triumphal, the top of this great arch over the main entrance to the Grand Palais.
About Valerie Besten too, which is that in a biography, the secondary characters are so important, and you want to draw them and bring them full of life. And Bacon's life is full of wonderful secondary characters, almost Dickensian characters who are great fun to write about. And Valerie Besten, their relationship, such an English relationship, is fascinating and complex. And again, this is a kind of wonderful photograph because he looks like he's lost and distracted, and his minder on the left, you know, lady with handbag, right? I mean, that's certain English kind of character, right?
Exactly, because it might have been. Did you want to say something before we went? Do you want to go back?
No, this is fine. But what I just wanted to talk a little bit about this show because it was, you cannot imagine the ascending into the pantheon that happened at this particular show. It was in a vast space, 134 paintings. All the French, Mitterrand, everybody else turned out for this event. And, you know, Bacon is going through the whole show with all of the important French dignitaries.
Yeah.
And then they had a huge dinner afterwards at Le Train Bleu restaurant, very old-fashioned. 500 people are there, you know, glittering mirrors all around. Francis Bacon is standing up, you know, accepting the accolades of the group. And but the backstory to this whole event, of this wonderful opening, was that the morning of the private view at this great event of Francis Bacon's life, George Dyer on the bicycle, had been discovered dead on the Loo in their hotel room, dead of an overdose of drugs and alcohol. And obviously, the timing could not have been worse. Had the news of George Dyer's death gotten out, it would have taken over the entire show. So Valerie Besten, the great minder, went to the French police. They summoned them to the hotel. They asked the police if the news of George Dyer's death could be held for a day. The French police said, "Mais oui." And so all while this great show and the dinner and everything is happening, George is dead back in the Loo. Francis Bacon, of course, knew this. It was a desperate moment for him, but he had to engage with the public and the dignitaries, and he did it.
And he painted George.
And that was the result.
There are a couple of triptychs.
He did a number of triptychs of George's death, and together they really amount to a very rare thing in 20th century art, but a sort of meditation on death.
Yeah.
And each of the triptychs is very different from the next. And this is maybe the most dramatic one, in fact, certainly is. Shows the moment of George's death, and there are many, many interesting things about it. But again, look at that bat shadow coming out of the body at the moment of death. You can see that he's probably from drugs. He's vomiting into the sink. On the left, he's died. In the center, he's dying. And there's that moment. And there's a lot of people would say, still today, and you understand what they mean, and I certainly do, because I sometimes feel that way myself. You know, enough, basta, a little much, no? Grand guignol, kind of, you know, over the top. And this bat shadow is, you know, again, it's like that dolphin cartoon in the triptych. Seems over the top. But after all, death is kind of over the top also. And if you look at what the Greeks did, who were always his gods, the Greek myths, you want to talk about over the top, grand guignol?
Well, and particularly in Aeschylus.
Particularly. So they say, you know, I don't know, art is at its art at its greatest tells the truth and helps us bear it. Would you agree with that?
Well,
with some of the?
I think he's always working this edge.
Yeah.
And sometimes he goes over it maybe too much, and sometimes this edge between good taste and bad taste. Good taste is not really what you're after if you're a great artist, you know. And he's working with the idea of too much, over the top, too much, and that's one of the ways that. One legitimate way to respond to the century and the life that he saw around him. It's risky. It's risky. You have to be able to pull it off. And he doesn't every time, I don't think. But here, it's an unforgettable image. And I think
it's started in, you know, I mean, it's immense tension and grief in that work. I think he pulls it off there. He pulls off the whole, and sometimes he doesn't. And we come to, of course, the John Edwards.
Are we going too long here?
No, we're all right. We're doing quite well now. We're nearly there. We have a few more, and I know people might like to ask questions. But so this is, of course, John Edwards.
Another very interesting thing about Francis Bacon's life is that he had such a full and complicated love life. It wasn't just sex, you know, one night nasty sex. In his early days, he had older lovers. He was sort of a filial son to older men who looked after him. Then he had the great love of his life, Peter Lacy, that we saw earlier, and then George Dyer, as Annalyn described, a working class lover from another world. This is John Edwards, also a working class guy who's a little edgy, you know. Even though he dresses like a sort of Brooks Brothers preppy character, he was an East Ender looking for an angle often. Bacon liked that. He liked how handsome he was. Edwards had another relationship and was less interested in sex than Francis was with Francis. And so their relationship evolved into a kind of a father-son relationship, which is fascinating.
And then this is John Edwards, the heir from whom we secured the donation. His other, towards the end of life, was Jose Capello.
Jose Capello. So, you know, as Mark said, John Edwards went very quickly in Bacon's life from being his love obsession. He was totally obsessed with him. But about 1979, 4 years into their relationship, John Edwards said, you know, I will be there for you as sort of family, but, you know, I'm going to stay with Philip Mordew, my lover. And about 6 or 7 years later, this very interesting man came into Francis Bacon's life. They met at the 85 final Tate retrospective, the second and final one of Bacon's career. Jose Capello, as you can tell, was very handsome. He was a madrileño. He came from a very upper-class family, was a banker, knew a couple languages, went to Wharton Business School in the States, was working for Bain Consulting. Very, very different from the East Enders that Francis Bacon had been attracted to. But he became, that's okay, he became very important in Bacon's life in the last 4 years. And also, out of that relationship came this very late triptych, 1991, and Mark can also talk about it, but the very interesting personal note about this is that Jose, the impetus for this is Jose was traveling to Asia and kind of leaving Francis Bacon behind. He was gradually moving away from Bacon because John Edwards was clearly the heir, and you know, and at a certain point the tension was too much. So he was going to Asia, and Bacon says, "Well, you know what? I might just, you know, paint a triptych about you. Would you mind?" And Jose said no, and so he came back from Asia. And there was the triptych. The only problem was, in the initial version of this triptych, there is obviously a Francis Bacon face in the right-hand panel. The left-hand panel was Jose, and it was very obviously Jose. Bacon painted some beautiful portraits of him, but he, again, being very proper, was very uncomfortable with what this painting is really saying, which is the two figures are obviously in the central panel coupling. So do you want to finish the story, Mark? Anyway, I'll finish and you can talk about it. There was a race car driver named Siena, I think it was Ayton Siena, right, at the time. And so when Jose very carefully said, well, it's a very good painting, but maybe you could reconsider. And so the face became that of a race car driver. But this is indeed his homage, Bacon's homage to Jose Capello is this painting.
I don't actually love this triptych. I don't think it's all that great, but it is interesting on a personal level because you can see the Jose figure and the Bacon figure. The idea of painting a photograph of the head over a painted body suggests how difficult it is, maybe, I'm interpreting here, but how difficult it is to finally reach somebody else. And their relationship was in trouble, kind of, at this point, or it was a complex one. Just the way the bodies are kind of disjointed and broken up. The two people on either side are in pieces and you cannot see their faces all that well. And then the lovemaking in the middle doesn't look so happy either. So it's a late melancholy
and the kind of the seeping of the death in the George Dyer triptych. That sort of like
that violet pool,
and which looks like death seeping out. But here there's a certain sadness in this coupling in the center. It's not there's a black shadow.
And you're stepping into a black geometry or stepping out of it.
Despair.
You're in between.
Yeah. It's a very solemn triptych, isn't it?
It is very solemn.
And then we go to the final triptych.
The final triptych, the second version of Studies for Three Figures at the Base of a Crucifixion.
He's criticized quite often for, at the end of his life, becoming too designy, too automatic, too kind of easy in a way. Another way to look at it, that may be true or not, I don't know, but it's another way to look at it is this is a perfect postmodern painting in a way. It's taking an earlier work and it's rephrasing it. And you feel the filters, don't you? I mean, not just the frame and the glass, but the distance and time that this image, this famous triptych, has traveled from 1945 to now. And how it has become more smooth, and maybe it should become more smooth.
And also huge.
Huge, yes, and kind of showy and spectacle. Those are also postmodern qualities. So oddly, at the end of his life, I think you can make an argument that he began to respond to and create a postmodern culture as well.
Which you have mentioned, Boo. And we just look at very late Bacon. Bacon, who, as you say, was always devoutly atheist, and yet was so extreme in it that one wonders, what was going on. Always this question of the nature of existence. And
Helen. Oh, sorry, Mark.
Go ahead.
Okay, Helen Lesueur, who was a wonderful dealer and critic in London, once wrote an essay about Francis Bacon, and she said the intensity of his anti-religious sensibility it elevated it into its own kind of religious feeling. How many people go through life feeling, just they have to engage with this subject even if they don't like it. So it's an interesting argument.
Yeah, the opposite of belief is not atheism, really. It's indifference.
Indifference.
And he was not indifferent.
He definitely was not indifferent. You're almost tempted, his crucifixion starts with the crucifixion. His series of popes, more crucifixions. Very Catholic, very Roman Catholic, the country out of which he came. I mean, it's a very spurious, but it's quite interesting that.
And his ragged,
but it's also theatrical. It's full of
like the Catholic Church,
tropes,
theatrical, ragged, sort of, bits of velvet corroding, and all kinds of.
But at the end of the day, also Rembrandt, obviously. At the end of the day, Francis Bacon really did go back. I mean, to those greater themes, all the way back to the Greek gods, and not the Greek gods, the Greek playwrights, but that says something. You know, he revered history in a time when most artists would run for the hills, you know, abstract expressionists and whatever. And there was Francis Bacon still painting sort of in an old master style, painting portraits. This one of his gods obviously was Rembrandt. He had two friends who went with him once to the Rijksmuseum, and they said it was the only time that they'd ever seen Francis Bacon in pure bliss, looking at the 22 Rembrandts that were in that museum. So along with Velázquez, and to a slightly lesser extent Goya, you know, those were his gods. And at the end of his life, he himself, he loved the socket in the Aix-en-Provence painting of Rembrandt. Do you remember? Yeah. He said, you know, he just paints sockets. The eyes are, he had this, he kept going on about nothing being illustration. Why do you bother? Mind you, there are stairs and things in his paintings at times, but we won't, but he was always wanted to get this immediate effect and trying to, you know, and so he really admired that portrait of Rembrandt's self-portrait in X, and with the socketless eyes. Exactly.
And look at him here.
And this, we put this in, Barbara put this in for us, just to talk about, to go from the Rembrandt, the late Rembrandt, which is obviously association here with the late Bacon self-portraits. As people died and he did more and more self-portraits, they became more steeped in a kind of that same sensibility as Rembrandt.
Again, without lines, you know, I mean, it's Venetian style. It's the flesh as paint and brush stroke, and not as firm.
Yeah, there's no defining lines at all.
Bacon really, I think he didn't like firm lines because he didn't believe in them. He didn't think that you could really enclose things successfully.
He was a big gambler. How much really do you think he did chance it? And how much was very, very deliberate? I mean, we have Eddie Batache saying that he threw the lump of white on the canvas.
And that's really, water,
So, but I think most of the time he was a very thoughtful.
You know, all the great traditions that make use of chance, they put chance in a logical construct. So I mean, that's the surrealists did that. You know, the idea was they organize chance in a certain way so that chance will produce certain effects. And one of the things that you can become, to your detriment, you can become a little good at chance. And I think that is a criticism of Bacon, that he got to know how to do these chancy things, right?
Yeah, some people called it tasty. The last paintings, you know, became so much more sort of formally beautiful. But you know, to your point, Barbara, the way he dealt with chance too is he would destroy so much work, you know. And I think to Mark's point, towards the very end of his career, he destroyed less. So there was this change, you know, in his sensibility, and he became sort of much more in command of his resources.
But chance really was essential to him. I mean, he believed, again, with the Greeks, you know, that fate could strike you down at any time, that it was just a roulette wheel, that, and if you were going to tell the truth in art, you had to respect that quality in life.
It was extraordinary, you know, life is meaningless, so you might as well be extraordinary, is what he kept saying.
His wonderful saying.
I mean, it was a passionate meaninglessness that he made extraordinary, you know, always searching for that.
I just wanted to say one last thing about this is just such a beautifully rendered face with no strong defining lines, and that again is sort of like Rembrandt, you know. And then if we go to the next slide, at the very end of his life, his like lodestar had really always been Velázquez and the Prado. And because of Jose Capello, he spent more time in Madrid. And one of the wonderful stories that we have in the book that we were lucky enough to get is in 1991, before he painted this is his last painting, but he went to the Prado often to see the Velázquez's. And Manuela Mena, who was the head of the Prado, got a surprise call. This is 1 year before Francis Bacon died. She gets a surprise call, and he says, Manuela Mena, this is Francis Bacon. Can I come to the gallery at an off day see the Velázquez's. And so she said, of course. And so he went through, and there was one particular painting, Velázquez's Mars, this sort of showing the god of war aging. And he stood in front of it, very poignant when you think about it, and that was what he was most drawn to. But this is very relevant to the end of Francis Bacon's life, because he died while he was down in Madrid going to visit Jose Capello. He became terribly ill. His doctor had said, do not travel. The doctor left town. He immediately got on a plane to go see Jose Capello, winds up in Madrid, and a couple weeks later in the Clínica Ruber, and he died in April of 1992. We always say that he obviously we think that he didn't want to die in his studio surrounded by great oxygen canisters. You know, he wanted to be in the South. That had been his like lodestar for so long. And he succeeded. He died there.
This is his last painting.
And it was he left it in his studio. And I think he was probably thought it likely that he was not going to return to this trip to Spain. And look, there it is, a bull of all things, a bullfight. This painting has only come into view recently, really. It has not been known. His last painting, his last finished painting, and you can see that he actually painted it partly with dust from the studio. Very important material, of course, for an asthmatic. It's all whispers. It's no shouts, no screams, none of that screaming color or anything. It's just all quiet, monochromatic, and it's, you know, if you think about what he's doing here, he stands in the place of the matador, doesn't he, in a bullfight, and he's looking at the bull, and the bull is annunciatory. The bull has one of his horns is a sickle, an ancient and classical symbol of death, and so it's as if the bull is the angel of death, and they're meeting one another's eye.
We just saw this painting at the Royal Academy. As Mark said, it was only recently discovered, and it is just eerie almost, because the canvas is almost just unpainted, except for the line on the right that's sort of that famous Bacon sort of railing. Yeah. And then the bull itself, you know, it is also insubstantial. So it's kind of a spirit world. You know, we go all the way back to von Schrenck-Notzing, you know, and this interest in spiritualism. And there you have the bull also. You know, Francis Bacon is on the threshold of the great beyond, and so is the bull.
Yeah, it's not as fleshy or as fatty.
No, a person at the RA told me that, well, she thought it really wasn't such a good painting. And yes, it doesn't have the juice of some of his paintings, but why should a very elderly man who's about to die be painting with lots of juice? You know, I mean, I think it's a fascinating picture as it is.
I just find it extraordinarily poetic.
I think it's more, I think the description, the sickle, the symbol of death, and as you say, why should he? No, he's calmed the rage and the passion. You know, it does recede, and with that, the paintings take on a different tenor, don't they?
The fight is over. You know?
Well, it's a different
bull
tenor. I mean,
for
if he was trying to paint those 60s or even 50s paintings, it's impossible, because it's not the same passion, as it's not the same thinking.
Why should you have an old man painting as well as a young man painting?
Exactly. It's been absolutely fascinating talk. Before I open it to the floor, I just wanted to say the writing in the book is seamless, the descriptions and the critique of the selected paintings, incisive and revealing. How do you're co-authors and you're also a couple, do you finish each other's sentences, or how does it work? Or is that a very big secret?
Well, we've learned that we've had this question before, as you can imagine, and we've determined that the subtext is always, how are you still married? Why haven't you gotten divorced? If people build a house together, they get divorced. Shouldn't people who build a book together get divorced? Well, we sort of keep that secret because it's like Coca-Cola. It's got its own formula. But I think we agree that it's really about rewriting
And rewriting and rewriting.
I think that's the way.
These books don't jump out of the computer.
No, they certainly don't. Well, thank you very much, Mark and Annalyn.
Thank you.
It's been absolutely fascinating.
Well, thank
and
you.
I hope you've all enjoyed that.